Hey folks, Zero here with my deck tech on my historic Grixis control deck. Figured I'd do it this way so that I don't have to put it at the start of the videos, and then I'll just upload this to YouTube so that people can just check it out there. So this is my Grixis control list. It's been doing pretty well. Um, it started off as just a Grixis control list from like Goldfish, but I didn't have enough of the rares to fill it out. So, kind of stuck a few different things in there and then went from there. And it's become sort of my version of it since then. So, this is the best of one list, just because I'm enjoying best of one because it gets you through games quickly. So, we have the usual discard suite of Agonizing Remorse and Thought Erasure. Remorse is much better against any of the lists that have like Row and stuff like that. You can get rid of them. Also lets you get rid of Cauldron Familiar. Um, yeah, Sacrifice is not a very good matchup for this deck, so Remorse comes in very handy there. And then Thought Erasure. I like to use Thought Erasure instead when I'm trying to find that next land or trying to find something specific next. It's because of the surveil effect, you get to sort of almost scry one. Then removal, it's Heartless Act. This is, in my opinion, definitely the best removal in Historic at the moment. Destroy target creature with no counters on it, or remove up to 3 counters from target creature. It kills pretty much everything in the format, and there's like the Tempered Steel lists play Stone Coil Serpent, and you can just remove 1/1 counters off that until it dies anyway. There are a few things that it struggles to kill, which is a bit annoying, but for that we have a few other things. There's one Legion's End. It's sort of in the air about taking it out or not. It's good that it shows you your opponent's hand and stuff like that, and it like can really get opponents if they keep hands with lots of the same creature in them. The fact that it only targets things with two converted mana cost 2 or less can be a bit of a problem though. And the other piece is Tyrant Scorn. I love this card. I saw a lot of lists not playing 4 of them, or some even playing none of them. But man, this has been so good. Like, it kills all the small aggressive creatures. If your opponent's cheating out things like, so for instance, against like the Solar Flare decks and stuff like that, if they're cheating out Ulamog and stuff from the bin, you can just Tyrant Scorn and bounce it back to their hand, and they can't cast it anyway. So it's been pretty good. Brazen Borrower, love this card. Absolutely love this card. It's just amazing. Returns things to your opponent's hands, but it's like any non-land permanent, so you can bounce things to buy yourself time if you need to. It's a reasonably aggressive creature as well. But good to note that it can't block things without flying. I've definitely got myself a few times thinking I can block with it. But yeah, it's great for taking out opponents' planeswalkers and just applying pressure as well. We've got Cry the Carnarium ×1. Great against the aggressive decks, and again, it exiles, so good against the sacrifice decks to try and get rid of Cauldron Familiar and whatnot. But you do have to make sure you cast it when their Witch's, I believe it's Witch's Cauldron, is tapped out. We've got a Murderous Rider, or 2 Murderous Riders. One of the only ways in the deck to recoup some of the life you lose to a lot of your spells, even the life that it uses to use its own spell. It's spot Planeswalker removal. Generally, you try and use some of the other removal to kill creatures, and then save this for the Planeswalkers themselves, because it's it's one of the only things in the deck that can actually target them. But yeah, you kind of want to remove things with it and then get it on the board as quick as possible, especially against the aggro decks, because it's a decent blocker and the lifelink just gets you the life back. So Kefnet, There is only one in the deck, but I seem to see it like every game. That might just be me though. It's almost impossible for your opponent to get rid of, which is great. Um, and the fact that it lets you just copy instants and sorceries that you draw is just so good. Like, you can get an agonizing remorse off a draw and then just not have to cast your actual copy of it, just cast the copy off Kefnet and then keep the other copy for later on when you need to get rid of something. Or if you need to just take out two things from their hand, you can just do one after the other. It lets you cast Extinction Event as odd and even. It will get rid of your Kefnet as well, but you can go odds first and then evens after. So that's pretty handy as well. Vraska's Contempt, our other answer to Planeswalkers, and Spot Exile for creatures. For the longest time, I thought this thing was you lose 2 life, but you gain 2 life. It's a bit of icing on the cake there, and instant speed, so happy days. The Eldest Reborn. This card's been really good when it's been really good, and just sort of meh when it's been bad. My only thing with it is I never want to cast it when my opponent has a clear board, because it just feels like such a waste of the first ability. But then it's got, your opponent discarding a card, which is handy, and then being able to bring back any of your planeswalkers or even just steal things of your opponents. Like, a lot of times I've brought back my opponent's Phyrexian Obliterator against Mono Black, and that's pretty good. Enter the God Eternals. It's 2 in there. It makes you an army, kills something of your opponent's, and gains you life, which is pretty handy. Like, the blocker that it makes is sizable, and the life gain is quite important in this deck. Yeah, it's just decent removal. It is sorcery speed. I kind of wish it was instant, but it'd probably be too good then. The king of the deck, Bolus. So once you establish this guy, if your opponent can't remove him, they start losing 1 card every turn to the exile. It's usually a card in their hand, but once they start running out of that, like against the really aggressive decks and stuff like that, their hands are usually empty. So you start like getting rid of their lands, and then that starts taking away from their ability to do anything. He answers creatures or planeswalkers with his -3. It's not usually the mode you want to use on him, because it then takes you so long to get up to his -8, which is the general win con that I use a lot in this deck. But, in a pinch, it's pretty good there. Liliana was one of the cards that I put in because I didn't have one of the other cards that was in the list. And she stayed. She's just been excellent. Like, the fact that you can play her, get blockers, and then those blockers also generate your card advantage when they die is just so good. Also, Bolus being able to take anybody else's abilities. There are small cases where you do want to use Liliana's +1 with Bolus and make 2 zombies in that turn instead, which is handy. Her minus being able to make creatures be sacked is very good, especially against indestructible things and things with protection from black or blue. And then her minus is almost the same as Bolus's. Taking your opponent down to 1 land is game over for a lot of decks. Taking your opponent down to 1 of any other thing doesn't usually make a huge difference because you're removing so many of their creatures anyway, and not a whole lot of decks end up with more than 1 planeswalker on the field. But yeah, she's been absolutely great. The mana base is slightly different from most of the lists. Like, I've got the Watery Graves, the Steam Vents, and the Blood Crypts at 4 each, and then 4 Drowned Catacomb as the check lands, 1 Sulphur Falls, 1 Dragon Skull Summit, and I've actually put a bunch of basics and some castles in here. So the Fabled Passage and the basics, I like to be able to thin out a deck that has 26 lands, especially because once you're at about 6 lands with this deck, you don't really need to draw any more lands. So I might replace it with more of the check lands later on, but for now I'm finding it pretty good. Castle Vantress has been amazing. Like, this card is excellent in this deck because you're waiting because you're not casting so many things at sorcery speed and waiting for your opponent to do things a lot. Vantress is great to have out because if your opponent doesn't do anything that you can answer that turn, or they just don't do anything at all, you're not wasting your turn. Being able to scry 2 means you can set up your next 2 draws or just get rid of things that you don't need. Important with Fabled Passage though, if you've scried enough cards to the bottom with Castle Vantress, it's probably not worth sacking this to thin out your deck, because you're actually just shuffling most of those cards into the deck as well. Apart from that, I like to be able to find basics. There's been a lot of games where I've made sort of like an army with Liliana or something like that, and opponents settle the wreckage. And being able to just get up to like 8 mana off their settle the wreckage has been really good as well. That said though, I am probably going to try out a list with no basics and no Fabled Passage and just more Sulphur Falls and Dragon Skull Summits. And the last card in the deck, which is my favorite part about the deck, is Fae of Wishes. So I noticed that in Best of 1, I had a lot of bad matchups that, well, not a lot of bad matchups, but some matchups where I just couldn't really do anything against their plan. And saw a bunch of people playing Fae of Wishes for granted to be able to use a wish board, and I am a huge fan of wish boards, so I decided I'd give those a crack. I think originally I had 4 Brazen Borrower and 1 more of something else. I think it was Thought Erasure that I took out for another Fae of Wishes. There's just 2 at the moment because you don't need it in every game, but it's really handy in those games where you come up against a list and like they play their second or third play and then you realize what they're on and then it's like, oh no. So there's Fae of Wishes there. Against aggressive decks, you can just drop it as a 2-drop because it is a 1/4 body which blocks, a lot of things. And then later on you can pick it up with its ability as well. Its ability is kind of costly, like discarding 2 cards is not something you want to do in this deck, but if you do have a silver bullet answer you can find off it, it's generally worth doing that. So we have in the Wishboard here a bunch of cards that are answers to decks that I kept running into and couldn't really do a whole lot against. So against like the burn mono red aggro decks, I've got Cling to Dust and Sovereign's Bite. I'll probably only end up keeping one of these cards, but I'm not sure which one yet, because this one requires them to have a creature in their bin, but you can keep casting it, and I did have a game the other day where I got to cast it like 4 times against, it was Mono Red or Gruul, I can't remember which one, but it was excellent. Sorry guys, got a bit of a sore throat at the moment. Grafdigger's Cage against any of the Uro decks and stuff like that. Stops a lot of those kind of shenanigans. And also Sacrifice stops them being able to pull their Cauldron Familiars back from the bin, which is very, very handy. The Elder Spell I put in because I ended up against a few like Bant lists and stuff like that, and there seems to be a Grixis Super Friends list out there as well, where they just sort of have like Narset, Ashiok, and then they'll have like Bolus, or in the other ones there'll be like Teferi, little Teferi, and then big Teferi, and then like a Narset or something like that. And usually you couldn't really come back from something like that, but if you can wish for the Elder Spell, kill all of those Planeswalkers at once, then you are in with a bit more of a chance. So it's actually, it's been pretty good there. Sorcerer Spyglass to answer many things, many things. I play Modern in Paper Magic a lot, and I almost always have a Pithing Needle in my sideboard, and Sorcerer Spyglass is sort of just along those lines as well. Narset against the draw millions of cards decks. There's a lot of decks at the moment that play a lot of Chemist's Insight. There's the Reclamation deck that plays Expansion, Explosion, and Thassa's Intervention, which both draw many cards, so she's good there. Also, she finds you. She's really good at finding you answers to things or getting you to bolus if you can't quite draw him yet. Cry of the Carnarium and Flame Sweep are both in there for the same reason against the small aggressive decks. Flame Sweep is in there because some of them play like Spectral Sailor and things like that at instant speed. Like Merfolk and stuff like that, I find the Flame Sweep's a bit better because it's at instant and you can hit them at the end of their turn after, or at the end of your turn after they've flashed things in, or at the end of theirs. Blood Sun is in there for Field of the Dead because I hate that card. Field is probably the deck that this struggles the most against. 5-color Field or Bant Field. Just because they have such good inevitability and you can keep answering all of their zombies, but unless you are putting enough pressure on to win the game at that point, you're not really getting anywhere. So yeah, I put Blood Sun in so that I can wish for it against those decks and just shut off that. Also, it turns off as Canter as well, which is very handy because that's another source of card advantage which really ruins you. Ashiok against any of the graveyard decks, being able to exile your opponent's graveyard so many times over is so good. Also, your opponent can't sack Fabled Passage or anything like that to search their libraries, and yeah, any of those things. She comes in on quite a bit of loyalty, which is handy as well. And even in some of the decks where they draw so many cards, you can just let them and then mill them out with Ashiok, which is also handy. Bedevil, this is an answer to artifacts mostly because I have answers to creatures and planeswalkers in the deck, but it's great in a pinch when you need to A, answer an artifact, or like B, answer one of their creatures or planeswalkers and you don't have any of the other removals in your deck. I've got one more Extinction event here because being able to wish for a Wrath is really, really handy. Yeah, that one's pretty self-explanatory. Karn is great against Tempered Steel. Stops them being able to do a lot of their things. I actually brought it in the other day. I wished for it against Gruul aggro so that they wouldn't be able to use their Embercleave. I could have grabbed the Bedevil, but I figured if they got a second Embercleave out, the Bedevil only really killed the first one, and then I had to deal with the second one. So I found Karn instead, and opponent spent a couple of minutes sitting there and trying to figure out why they couldn't equip their Embercleave. So that was pretty funny. And then I used his -2 to find Sorcerer Spyglass so that I could also name Embercleave with that because they did inevitably kill Karn. Thought Distortion is here against any of the lists that play lots of counterspells and draw power. We don't have any counterspells, we just have hand disruption, so being able to sort of strip their hand out and not have to deal with any of the counterspells anymore is really handy because obviously this can't be countered, so it's happening no matter what. It is a pretty high cost, so you generally can't cast it in the turn that you wish for it, but you know, unless your opponent can get it out of your hand before then, it's happening. Chandra is here for an alternate win con. So sometimes you get unlucky and you don't draw your Bolus or your Liliana for ages. When that happens and you need to put pressure on, Chandra's great. A, because she can't be countered, so against the control lists and stuff like that, they can't actually stop you playing her. And once you've got her down, you're +2ing, and that emblem's there no matter what. So they are losing 1 life per turn. It's not a huge amount of pressure, but it is something. She also can deal 3 damage to each non-elemental creature, which is great against the small aggro decks and stuff like that. There are some creatures in there that are elementals that won't get hit by it, but yeah, she's good there. And then her -X I haven't used a whole lot, but it is spot removal against planeswalkers and creatures, and it does exile them, so that's also pretty handy. Also, when you have Chandra down and you have a Bolus out afterwards, you can just start doubling up on the emblems and just getting them real hard. Yeah, so that's the deck. I love the wishboard, and I initially thought that it might be a bit slow because Granted costs 4 to cast, but it's actually been pretty good. Like, in a lot of games, you can just figure out what you're against, turn 4 cast Granted, and then find your answer in here and be able to use that against them. I think that's about it. So my next stream, I'll be playing a bit of Historic, and this is the list I'll be playing. So thought I'd get this up so didn't have to put it in the front of the stream. Thanks for watching, people.